The impact of my body colliding with the hardwood wasn't what haunted me most. What stayed with me was the deafening quiet that came after. 23 relatives surrounding that table, and nobody moved to assist me. My own mother sat frozen, her fork suspended midway between her plate and her mouth, as if someone had pressed pause on her entire existence. I'm Madison Barrett. I'm 29 years old. And before that December evening, I believed I understood what hitting rock bottom felt like. I'd lost my father to cancer when I was 19. I'd watched my mother marry a man I instinctively distrusted within 2 years. I'd seen my inheritance mysteriously evaporate. I'd worked myself to exhaustion while my stepsister partied through life on money that should have been used for the family business. But turns out rock bottom goes deeper, and it carries the scent of my stepfather's aftershave, blended with evergreen and treachery. That scent still makes me nauseous to this day. Before we continue, I'd appreciate if you could hit that like button and drop a comment sharing where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your location. Tell me if you've ever had a family member betray you, because trust me, this story is going to resonate with more people than you'd think. I truly appreciate your support, and it helps me continue sharing these stories that need to be heard. Now, let me transport you back to that Christmas Eve at the Barrett-Sullivan family celebration. Picture this, a sprawling dining room in my childhood home in Portland, Oregon. The home my father built with his own hands, room by room, over 15 years. The same home Derek somehow convinced my mother to put in his name just 3 years into their marriage. The chandelier my father installed himself hung over a table that could seat 30 people. My grandmother's antique china, the set she'd brought from Ireland in 1960, gleamed under the soft lighting. You know the kind of gathering I'm talking about. Coordinated holiday sweaters nobody genuinely enjoys wearing, the kind with reindeer and snowflakes that itch like crazy. Enough dishes to sustain a battalion, including my grandmother's famous honey-glazed ham that took 16 hours to prepare, her traditional Irish soda bread that she'd been making since before my mother was born, and enough side dishes that the table literally groaned under the weight. And of course, tension simmering beneath the surface like underseasoned sauce, the kind of tension that makes everyone speak just a little too loudly and laugh just a little too forcefully at jokes that aren't funny. Derek Sullivan had been part of our family as my stepfather for a decade, but that particular evening he reached peak form. I'd noticed him becoming more aggressive over the past few months, more bold in his cruelty, as if he'd finally decided he didn't need to pretend anymore. Looking back, I realize he must have thought he'd won completely. My mother was entirely under his control, the family business was his playground, and I was just the stepdaughter who worked too much and complained too little. He'd been consuming his supposedly premium wine since midday, which I knew from experience meant trouble. I'd learned to read his drinking patterns like a meteorologist reads storm clouds. 1 glass meant he'd be tolerable. 3 glasses meant snide comments. 5 glasses, which is where he was that evening, meant someone was going to get hurt. The wine, by the way, I'd discovered months earlier was simply cheap bottles from discount stores, the kind that cost $8, transferred into expensive decanters to make it look sophisticated. He kept the real expensive bottles locked in his study, selling them online for extra cash. Throughout the evening, he kept making these snide remarks about how I occupied prime territory at the dining table, the seat at my father's right hand, the position of honor in our family. It's where I'd sat since I was tall enough to reach the table without a booster seat. My father used to rest his hand on my shoulder during grace, a gesture that made me feel protected and cherished. Derek knew this. He knew exactly what that seat meant. That's why he wanted it for Ashley. He kept insinuating that certain people earn their positions while others simply inherit them. He said it with that passive-aggressive tone he'd perfected over the years, the kind where the words sound almost reasonable, but the malice underneath is unmistakable. My cousin Rachel, who'd been my best friend since childhood, kept exchanging glances with me that screamed, "What's gotten into him tonight?" She'd witnessed Derek's behavior over the years, but even she seemed surprised by his boldness. Her husband James, normally oblivious to family drama, had stopped eating and was watching Derek with narrowed eyes. Even my usually conflict-averse Uncle Gregory was shifting uncomfortably in his seat. The tension in the room had become so thick you could cut it with a knife, yet nobody said anything. That's what our family had become under Derek's influence, a group of people who'd learned that speaking up only made things worse. Then, at precisely 7:47 in the evening, I remember distinctly, because I'd been fixated on the antique grandfather clock in the corner, the one my father had restored himself, to avoid making eye contact with anyone. Everything shifted. The entrance flew open with that theatrical flair only Ashley could execute. My stepsister making her entrance 2 hours behind schedule, which was actually early for her standards. She burst through the door like she was walking onto a red carpet, head held high, designer sunglasses still on even though it was dark outside, and she was indoors. The temperature outside was below freezing, but she was dressed in an outfit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, complete with fur-trimmed boots and a jacket with a label I recognized from a luxury boutique downtown. Luxury boutique bags clutched in her hands despite declaring financial ruin the previous month. I'm talking about the kind of bags that cost thousands of dollars, bags with names like Chanel and Louis Vuitton emblazoned on them. She'd called my mother crying just 3 weeks earlier, claiming she was about to be evicted, begging for money. Apparently that crisis had been resolved through another infusion of cash from Derek's magic money tree, also known as the family business my father had built. Derek's entire demeanor transformed as if she were royalty arriving. I'm talking about a complete personality shift. The cruel, sneering drunk vanished, replaced by a doting father whose face literally lit up like someone had turned on a spotlight. He jumped up from his seat with more energy than I'd seen from him in months, knocking his wine glass over in the process. Red wine spread across my grandmother's antique Irish linen tablecloth like blood, but he didn't even notice. His eyes were locked on Ashley like she was the only person in the room. "There's my girl," he announced to everyone, his voice booming with pride. "There's my beautiful, successful daughter." Successful, I thought bitterly. She'd failed at 6 different careers in the past 5 years, but in Derek's eyes, Ashley could do no wrong. She could burn down an orphanage and he'd praise her initiative. What transpired next continues replaying in my mind like a slow-motion sequence, the kind you see in movies right before something terrible happens. Derek rose from his chair with purpose, his movements suddenly focused despite the wine he'd consumed. He approached where I'd been seated, each step deliberate, his eyes locked on me with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't just anger or contempt. It was something darker, something that spoke of a decision made and consequences be damned. The identical position I'd occupied for 29 years, through birthday dinners and holiday celebrations, through the good times before my father got sick, and the hard times after he died. The spot my deceased father always called Madison's place, even having a small bronze plaque made for it when I was 16. It read simply, "Madison's Throne," and it was a joke between us, his way of making me feel special, of reminding me that I would always have a place at this table, in this family, in this home. Derek approached that seat like a conquering general approaching enemy territory. The entire room went silent. Even Ashley stopped her grand entrance to watch what was happening. Uncle Mark pulled out his phone, I noticed in my peripheral vision, always ready to capture drama for his social media audience. Derek stood beside me, swaying slightly, and declared to the entire gathering that his biological daughter needed a suitable location at the table. Not a seat, not a chair, a suitable location, as if we were discussing real estate values. "Ashley needs to sit here," he announced, his hand gripping the back of my chair. "This is where the real daughter of this family should sit." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Real daughter. As if my 29 years in this family, my 19 years as my father's daughter, counted for nothing. I saw my mother flinch at those words, but she didn't speak. Nobody spoke. When I failed to vacate quickly enough, when I sat there frozen trying to process what was happening, he seized my chair while I remained seated and jerked it backward with surprising force. The violence of the movement shocked me. This wasn't just removing a chair. This was a physical attack, a statement of power, a declaration that I no longer had any protection in this family. I attempted to stand, my legs tangling with the chair legs, and became entangled in the tablecloth as I grabbed for purchase. The antique linen my grandmother had brought from Ireland, the tablecloth that had covered this table for family celebrations for over 6 decades, came with me. I crashed down forcefully, my hip striking the wooden floor with an impact that knocked the breath from my lungs. The pain was immediate and sharp, radiating up my side. My outfit, the vintage dress I'd inherited from my mother, the one she'd worn to her first Christmas with my father, tore along the seam with a sound like fabric screaming. The berry compote, my grandmother's special recipe that took hours to prepare, went airborne in a spectacular arc, splattering across the hardwood floor. The antique rug my great-grandmother had woven by hand, and several family members' expensive shoes. Dishes clattered and crashed. Someone's wine glass shattered. The sound seemed to echo forever in that suddenly silent room. But the absolute worst part, worse than the physical pain, worse than the humiliation, worse than the ruined dress and the destroyed tablecloth, was that silence. 23 individuals, my own mother included, simply observed as though witnessing dinner entertainment. Not one person moved to help me. Not one voice raised in protest. They just sat there, forks suspended, mouths slightly open, watching like I was a performer who'd just executed a particularly dramatic pratfall. My grandmother released this faint gasp, the type she typically reserves for witnessing improper etiquette at formal dinners, as if someone using the wrong fork was comparable to watching her granddaughter being physically assaulted. Uncle Mark, heaven help his tacky soul, held his mobile device in portrait orientation, recording the entire incident, his finger steady on the screen, presumably believing it would generate amusing social media content. I could see the red recording dot from where I lay on the floor. My mother's expression displayed that practiced frozen look she'd mastered throughout the years, the one communicating she witnessed nothing, heard nothing, and would acknowledge nothing. Her face had become a mask, carefully blank, her eyes focused on some point in the middle distance. It was the same expression she'd worn when Derek had convinced her to sign over the house. The same expression when he'd depleted my college funds. The same expression she'd perfected over a decade of choosing comfort over conscience. As I pulled myself upright, my hands sticky with berry sauce, the staining spreading across my grandmother's heirloom dress like an accusation, I overheard Derek muttering something about how I should feel fortunate to even receive an invitation. "She should thank me for letting her be here," he said, not even bothering to lower his voice. Taking up space at my table, eating my food. My table. My food. Everything my father had built had become Derek's in his mind. Ashley had taken my seat, arranging herself like a queen claiming her throne, completely oblivious or uncaring about what had just transpired. She pulled out her phone and started taking selfies, angling for the best light from the chandelier my father had installed. That's when I noticed it. His business mobile device unlocked and visible on the kitchen counter, the screen still lit up. In my professional world of regulatory oversight, we describe that as an opening. Actually, we call it a gift from the universe. I'd been working in corporate compliance for 7 years at that point. My job was literally to find evidence of fraud and financial misconduct. I'd been trained by the best, had developed an almost supernatural ability to spot irregularities, and had put 3 executives in prison with my testimony. And Derek had just left his entire digital life accessible on his unlocked phone. I departed that evening with my self-respect shattered, my body bruised, my dress ruined, and my relationship with my family possibly destroyed forever. But something else remained whole. My father's aged laptop concealed in my vehicle, the one I'd been too afraid to examine for a year, and photographs of every single message on Derek's device. Hundreds of photographs, taken methodically in the kitchen while the rest of the family was distracted by dessert. Text messages, emails, banking apps, everything. My hands had been shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone steady, but adrenaline and rage had made me focused. He assumed he'd intimidated a powerless person, pushed around someone who would just accept her new place in the social hierarchy he'd created. He was about to discover that sometimes the powerless person possesses all the information, and information is the only power that really matters. To comprehend why that shove meant everything, you need understanding of what the preceding decade resembled. Let me take you back to the beginning, to where this whole nightmare started. Derek Sullivan entered our existence like a rescuer in protective gear. If that gear originated from budget retailers and rescuers operated leased luxury vehicles they couldn't truly afford. My mother had lost my father to pancreatic cancer 2 years prior when Derek materialized at our congregation's support group for widowed individuals. St. Michael's Church on the east side of Portland had a Wednesday evening group for people dealing with grief. My mother had been attending for 18 months, finding comfort in shared stories and communal healing. Then Derek Sullivan walked through those doors. Retrospectively, his presence there resembled a predator joining a vulnerable prey support circle. He was handsome in a generic way, the kind of good looks that come from expensive haircuts and well-fitted suits rather than actual bone structure. He had this way of looking at you that made you feel like you were the only person in the room, a practiced charm that I now recognize as a con artist's stock in trade. He told a heartbreaking story about losing his wife to breast cancer 3 years earlier, about raising his daughter Ashley alone, about struggling to balance work and parenting, about how lonely the world felt without a partner. Women in the group, including my mother, ate it up with a spoon. I attended one of those meetings with my mother. I was 20 years old, trying to balance college classes and helping my mother manage her grief. I sat in the back of that church basement, drinking terrible coffee from a styrofoam cup, and watched Derek work the room. That's the only way I can describe it. He wasn't grieving. He was working. He focused on my mother more rapidly than Ashley depletes credit accounts, which, as I would later learn, was extremely rapidly indeed. He seemed to know exactly what to say, exactly when to offer a comforting touch, exactly how to position himself as both strong enough to support her and vulnerable enough to need her. Within 2 months, they were dating. Within 6 months, he'd moved into our house. Within a year, they were married in a ceremony that happened so quickly I barely had time to process it. The preferential treatment between me and Ashley began subtly at first, small enough that I convinced myself I was imagining it, that I was just being sensitive or jealous or unreasonable. Ashley received an automobile for her 18th birthday, a brand new Honda Civic with a big red bow on top, parked in our driveway on her birthday morning. Derek made a big production of it, inviting neighbors to watch, taking videos, posting on social media about what a wonderful father he was. When I reached 18, 6 months later, Derek gifted me public transportation passes and a lecture about independence and self-sufficiency, a book of bus tickets wrapped in newspaper with a card that read, "Time to learn about the real world." I genuinely laughed initially, assuming he was building resilience in me, teaching me some kind of life lesson about not being spoiled. My mother assured me that's what he was doing. Derek has Ashley's best interests at heart too, she told me when I expressed confusion. He just shows his care differently. I actually believed her. The irony was entirely on me. Higher education revealed where circumstances became intriguing, and by intriguing I mean where the theft began in earnest. My father had established educational accounts for me before his passing. He'd started them when I was born, contributing regularly for 19 years. I'd viewed the documentation when I was younger, sitting with my father in his study while he explained compound interest and investment strategies. He'd shown me statements showing over $80,000 saved for my college education. He'd been so proud of it, so excited about my future, about how I wouldn't have to burden myself with student loans like he had. "You're going to have opportunities I never had," he'd told me, his hand on my shoulder, his eyes bright with plans for my future. But when attempting to access those accounts after my father's funeral, when I went to enroll at Portland State University, the accounts were mysteriously depleted, almost empty, with only a few $1,000s remaining. "Market fluctuations," Derek clarified, sitting in my father's study, behind my father's desk, using my father's computer. "The 2008 financial crisis really devastated these accounts," he explained with what seemed like genuine sympathy. "Your father made some unfortunate investment choices right before he got sick. He probably didn't want to worry you about it. It made sense at the time. I was 20, naive, trusting, and drowning in grief. I didn't think to ask for documentation. I didn't think to verify his claims. I just accepted it and took out student loans." Meanwhile, Derek somehow located $60,000 for Ashley's arts degree at an exclusive institution in California, a private liberal arts college that cost more per year than most people make in salary. She abandoned her studies junior year to pursue social media influence, moving back home with credit card debt and absolutely no degree to show for the investment. Her online platform maintains 247 followers today, approximately half being automated accounts that generate generic comments like, "Nice post," and "Love this." My mother transformed during those years as well, in ways that were subtle at first, but became increasingly disturbing as time went on. She evolved from the individual who organized charitable events and commanded admiration throughout our community, who'd chaired the hospital fundraising gala 3 years running, who'd built a successful career as a real estate agent, who'd been known for her sharp mind and sharper wit. She'd been the kind of woman other women looked up to, came to for advice, trusted with their secrets. Derek turned her into his personal echo chamber, his validation machine, his enabler. Whatever Derek believes is optimal became her repeated phrase, like she was a programmed doll with limited responses. Whatever Derek thinks is best, she'd say about decisions large and small, where to go for dinner, whether I could borrow the car, how to handle conflicts with Ashley, whether to sell investments my father had made. Everything was filtered through Derek's opinion, and his opinion was treated as gospel truth. I watched her dim over those years, like someone was slowly turning down her light. The genuine betrayal, the real knife twist that I didn't discover until much later, was the family enterprise, my father's legacy, built from absolutely nothing. My father, Thomas Barrett, had started a small logistics and warehousing company when I was 5 years old. He'd begun with 1 truck and 1 warehouse, working 18-hour days, building relationships with clients through reliability and integrity. By the time I was in high school, Barrett Logistics employed 35 people and had contracts with major retailers throughout the Pacific Northwest. It was his pride and joy, second only to his family. He'd always talked about how it would be mine someday, how he was building something that would outlast him, that would take care of his family for generations. That modest yet profitable transportation and warehousing company now operated under Derek's authority. He'd persuaded my mother to appoint him chief executive while she remained grief-stricken, just 4 months after my father's funeral. He'd convinced her that the company needed strong male leadership, that my father's business partners would respect him more than a grieving widow, that it was what my father would have wanted. All lies, but effective ones. I observed him strutting around my father's workspace, a corner office with windows overlooking the warehouse floor, utilizing my father's recreational golf equipment that had been gifts from grateful clients. He sat in my father's leather chair, the one that had molded to my father's shape over 15 years. He hung his college degrees on the wall, covering the spots where my father's certifications and awards had hung. He brought in his own coffee maker, his own desk accessories, his own everything, systematically erasing every trace of my father from that space. Within a year, he'd pushed out 3 of my father's oldest employees, men who'd been there since the beginning, who'd helped my father build the company from nothing. He replaced them with his own people, starting with his golf buddy Steve. The company culture changed. The family atmosphere my father had cultivated, where he knew every employee's name and asked about their kids, where he threw summer barbecues and Christmas bonuses were generous, all of that vanished. Derek ran it like a piggy bank, making decisions based on what benefited him personally, rather than what was good for the company long-term. But here's what Derek remained unaware of, what he couldn't have known because he'd underestimated me so completely. I'd been monitoring more than he comprehended. 3 years into their union, I'd discovered inconsistencies in the enterprise records during a Thanksgiving family gathering, where he'd abandoned his laptop accessible in the study. I'd gone to find a quiet place to make a phone call and found his computer open, accounting software pulled up on the screen. I'm trained to spot irregularities, and what I saw made my heart race. Expenses that didn't make sense. Payments to companies I'd never heard of. Missing inventory. I took photos with my phone, not knowing what I'd do with them but knowing they were wrong. 5 years in, I observed property transfers that seemed illogical. The warehouse building my father had purchased outright, that had been fully paid off and owned by the company, suddenly had a mortgage. The company vehicles that had been assets were now leased. The changes seemed designed to extract equity, to make the company appear less valuable on paper while Derek pocketed cash. 7 years in, I commenced maintaining duplicates of everything I could access. Every financial document I came across, every overheard conversation, every time Derek left his computer accessible or his phone unlocked. I started keeping a file, both digital and physical, hidden in various locations. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was letting my dislike of Derek color my judgment, but I kept collecting evidence anyway. Last Thanksgiving, a year before the Christmas push, my grandmother pulled me aside in the cooking area. Grandmother Elizabeth, my father's mother, was 85 years old and sharper than most people half her age. She'd been watching Derek for years with those bright, intelligent eyes, saying nothing, but missing nothing. She'd survived the Depression, raised 6 children, buried 2 husbands, and she understood human nature in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. She pressed something into my palm, a storage device, a small USB drive that felt heavy with possibility. "Your father's aged laptop," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sounds of dinner preparation, the one from the storage area that Derek said he threw out. I saved it. Don't allow Derek knowledge you possess it. There are items on there, items he should have disclosed to you before passing. He knew Madison. He knew what Derek was. Then she returned to preparing the holiday bird as though she hadn't just handed me a potential explosive device. Her hands were steady as she basted the turkey, but I saw her glance at Derek through the doorway, and the look in her eyes was pure steel. Derek grew increasingly audacious as Ashley failed at occupation after occupation. The pattern became so predictable, I could have set my watch by it. First, she aspired to become a fashion creator, launching a boutique that sold overpriced vintage clothing to her friend group. It failed within 6 months, losing $40,000. Then an event coordinator, starting a party planning business that collapsed after she botched a wedding so badly the couple threatened legal action. Another $30,000 lost. Then a life counselor, which seemed ironic considering she couldn't organize her own existence, couldn't maintain a relationship longer than 3 months, and spent money like it grew on trees. She took a weekend certification course and started calling herself a life transformation specialist. That venture lasted 2 months before the client started demanding refunds. Each failure cost thousands of dollars, and I mean serious money, the kind of money that should have raised questions. And speculate where that funding originated? The enterprise my father constructed, Barrett Logistics, being systematically drained to fund Ashley's dreams. Derek would rage about entitled millennials after each failure, giving speeches at dinner about how this generation had no work ethic, no commitment, no understanding of sacrifice. He'd slam his fist on the table and deliver lectures about responsibility and follow-through. Then somehow, within weeks, he'd discover funding to finance her subsequent disaster, appearing with a check and encouragement to try again, because we can't let one setback define us. Meanwhile, I was working 60-hour weeks in regulatory oversight for a mid-sized financial firm, taking night classes for my accounting certification because my depleted education fund meant I had to pay for continuing education myself, living in a tiny apartment, driving a car with 200,000 miles on it, eating ramen more nights than I care to admit, and still hearing about how Ashley represented the family's future, how she was entrepreneurial and creative and just needed the right opportunity. The hypocrisy was staggering. Christmas night, after the push, after the humiliation, after gathering my torn dress and my shattered dignity and driving home in shocked silence, I occupied my apartment with ice on my injury and fury in my core. My hip had already developed a bruise the size of a grapefruit, deep purple and painful to touch. I'd have that bruise for weeks, a physical reminder of what had happened. The sparkling beverage I'd transported for the family celebration, an expensive bottle of champagne I'd spent way too much money on because I'd wanted to contribute something nice, remained unopened on my counter. Apparently, humiliation pairs more effectively with coffee and rage. I made a pot of coffee at 11 p.m., knowing I wouldn't sleep anyway, my mind racing too fast to even consider rest. I retrieved my father's aged laptop, the one I'd concealed in my closet for 12 months, hidden behind boxes of old textbooks and winter clothes. I'd been excessively frightened to access it, excessively frightened of what I might or might not discover. What if it was nothing? What if my grandmother's dramatic warning was just the paranoia of an old woman who'd never liked Derek? What if there was nothing there that could help me, and I was truly powerless against him? But also, what if there was something? What if my father had left me a weapon I didn't know I possessed? The storage device my grandmother had provided felt substantial in my hand, weighty with possibility. Tonight seemed like the appropriate moment to finally examine it. The appropriate moment? Hell, it was past time. I'd been pushed down in front of my entire family and nobody had helped me. If there was ever a moment to stop being afraid and start fighting back, this was it. The laptop was old, a model from 2015, its case scratched and worn from years of use. I remembered my father using it, typing away at the kitchen table late at night, his reading glasses perched on his nose. I plugged it in, praying the battery would still hold a charge after all these years. The access code was my birth date, 07131995. My father possessed brilliance in business but terrible security habits, using the same password for everything. It was something I'd teased him about when I was younger, back when I understood nothing about digital security or the importance of what he might have been protecting. The laptop booted up slowly, the old hard drive whirring and clicking. What loaded up made my hands shake so violently I had to set down my coffee cup. The desktop background was a photo of me and my father from my high school graduation, both of us grinning, my cap askew, his arm around my shoulders. The sight of his face, frozen in that moment of pride and joy, made my eyes burn with tears I'd been holding back all evening. Electronic mail archives extending back 15 years, folders meticulously organized by year and subject. My father had been a pack rat when it came to digital information, saving everything, organizing it obsessively. Directories labeled insurance, will for Madison, business finances, and one that made my stomach plummet labeled if circumstances occur. Each folder was color-coded and carefully named, like he'd been preparing for something, like he'd known he might not be around to explain it all to me personally. I opened the If Circumstances Occur folder first, my cursor hovering over it for a solid 30 seconds before I could force myself to click. Inside were dozens of subdirectories: Derek background, financial irregularities, legal documentation, evidence, contacts. My father had been investigating Derek. For how long? Since when? Before he died or after they got married? The first discovery struck like frozen water cascading down my spine, shocking and clarifying in equal measure. My father's testament, his actual will, the authentic legal document, contained specific protections I'd never witnessed during the probate process. The family enterprise was intended to be maintained in trust until I reached 30 years old, with obligatory financial distributions commencing at 25 to support me while I built my career. The residence my father had built with his own hands was never supposed to transfer into Derek's ownership at all. It was supposed to be held in trust for me, with my mother having life estate, meaning she could live there until she died but couldn't sell it or mortgage it. There existed safeguards, stipulations, clauses protecting everything my father had built, detailed legal language that had clearly been drafted by an attorney who knew exactly what they were doing. So where existed this testament during the probate process? When Derek had presented the will to the court, when my mother and I had sat in that attorney's office going through my father's affairs, this wasn't the document we'd seen. I retrieved Derek's device photographs from earlier in the evening, scrolling through hundreds of images I'd taken in that kitchen while my family ate dessert. Thank heavens for his self-absorption and narcissism requiring a 15-minute photography session with the holiday meat before dinner, leaving his phone unlocked and accessible for anyone to grab. His text communications told a narrative superior to any streaming drama series I'd ever watched. Hundreds of messages, months of conversations, all of it painting a picture of corruption and desperation. Ashley owed currency to individuals with names like Big Marcus and Vegas Danny. Loan sharks, apparently, the kind of people who don't accept payment plans or sob stories. The figures made my vision blur, my accounting-trained mind automatically calculating interest rates and repayment schedules. $200,000 in gambling debts, possibly more. Ashley had apparently discovered online gambling during her brief stint in California, developing an addiction that had spiraled completely out of control. Derek had been managing multiple creditors like a circus performer, juggling obligations, making promises, robbing Peter to pay Paul, and then robbing Paul to pay Mary. The messages showed increasing desperation, threats becoming more explicit, deadlines being extended and then shortened. Then I discovered the treasure trove, the evidence that transformed this from family drama into actual prosecutable fraud. Communications between Derek and someone named Steve, his business partner at Barrett Logistics, discussing restructuring the enterprise assets in ways that had nothing to do with sound business practices and everything to do with hiding money. They were discussing relocating inventory internationally, establishing shell corporations in Delaware and Nevada, utilizing the family enterprise as security for personal loans that were financing Ashley's lifestyle and paying her gambling debts. In my professional field, working in regulatory oversight and corporate compliance, we possess a specific term for this pattern of behavior. We call it fraud. We call it embezzlement. We call it criminal misappropriation of corporate assets. And I was very, very good at documenting it, at building cases that could withstand legal scrutiny. My device vibrated insistently on the table beside me, making me jump. The family messaging group was experiencing absolute chaos, messages appearing so rapidly I could barely read them. Uncle Mark's recording of my fall had been published to his social media accounts with crying, laughing emoticons, captioned, "When you fight over seats at Christmas dinner," with hashtags designed for maximum visibility. But the reactions weren't what he'd anticipated or hoped for. The comments section was turning on him rapidly. Cousin Rachel, bless her righteous fury, wrote, "Mark, what the actual hell is your problem? You just watched someone get assaulted and you filmed it for entertainment? What is wrong with you?" Aunt Susan, my mother's younger sister who usually stayed out of family conflicts, added in all capital letters, "This is revolting. Delete this immediately. That was assault, Mark. Assault." Other family members were chiming in, some defending me, some defending Derek, some just confused and asking what had really happened. The thread had devolved into chaos, with people taking sides, old grudges surfacing, years of family dysfunction bubbling up in a spectacular display. My device rang, Rachel's name appearing on the screen. I answered, my voice coming out rough and shaky. She was crying, which was unusual for Rachel, who prided herself on being tough and practical. She apologized for not helping me at dinner, for freezing like everyone else, for being a coward. Then she told me something that made everything connect in a way I hadn't expected, that added another layer to the disaster that was Derek's house of cards. She'd been performing legal assistant work for a firm managing foreclosures, basic administrative work to help pay her law school tuition. It was boring work usually, processing paperwork for properties going into foreclosure, most of them sad stories of people who'd fallen on hard times. And she'd observed our mother's residence, the house I'd grown up in, the house my father had built with his own hands, on a preliminary roster. Derek had secured 3 mortgages without informing anyone, extracting every possible cent of equity from that property, using it as collateral for loans he'd taken out to cover his and Ashley's expenses. The residence my father constructed with his own labor, room by room over 15 years, was approaching loss to compensate for Ashley's failed boutique, her failed mobile eatery business, her failed life coaching practice, her gambling debts, her shopping addiction, her failed everything. The house where I'd learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where I'd had my first kiss on the front porch, where my father and I had painted my bedroom purple when I was 12, where he'd taught me to cook in that kitchen, where every corner held a memory of him. Derek was going to lose it all because he couldn't stop stealing, and Ashley couldn't stop spending. I felt something shift inside me in that moment, some final hesitation falling away. I'd been raised to be polite, to avoid conflict, to keep the peace. My father had taught me to be strong, but also to be kind, to give people the benefit of the doubt. But there's a point where kindness becomes complicity, where silence becomes enabling. Derek had pushed me past that point, literally and figuratively. I accessed my laptop and commenced typing. Every electronic communication I composed was carefully crafted, professional in tone, but devastating in content. I'd been trained in compliance documentation, in building cases that could withstand scrutiny, in presenting evidence in ways that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. I scheduled each email to transmit at 300 hours in the morning, calculated to arrive when people would see them first thing, when they'd have maximum impact. Each recipient was carefully selected. To Derek's business associates, Steve and the others, I sent detailed documentation of the financial irregularities, evidence of his fraudulent use of company assets, proof that he'd been lying to them about the company's financial health. These were businessmen who'd tolerated a lot, but they wouldn't tolerate theft that put their own investments at risk. To the federal tax authorities' tip line, I submitted 5 years of inconsistencies I'd documented, discrepancies between what Barrett Logistics reported and what the company had actually earned. Tax evasion is one of those crimes that authorities take very seriously, with substantial resources dedicated to prosecution. To the State Prosecutor's Office White-Collar Crime Division, I sent the evidence of embezzlement, of using corporate assets for personal benefit, of fraud perpetrated against my mother and me. To Ashley's creditors, the loan sharks with threatening names, I sent Derek's actual financial documentation, his genuine assets, including the hidden accounts I'd discovered, proof that he'd been lying about his finances while his daughter avoided payment after payment. Let them go after Derek's actual money instead of threatening a gambling addict who had nothing. To my mother, I sent the authentic testament, the real will that showed what my father had actually wanted, plus comprehensive documentation of every property transfer Derek had manipulated her into signing, every fund withdrawal he'd authorized from accounts that should have been protected, every single item Derek had stolen while she grieved for her husband. Each communication was flawless, professional, and devastating. 10 years of compliance training was about to compensate in ways my employer never envisioned when they'd sent me to all those seminars on fraud detection and evidence documentation. I included Uncle Mark's video recording in several of the emails, particularly the ones going to investigators. Let them observe precisely who Derek Sullivan genuinely was. Let them see his true character displayed for all the world. The man who'd push his stepdaughter down at Christmas dinner was the same man who'd steal from his own wife, embezzle from his own company, and endanger his daughter's life by refusing to address her gambling addiction properly. By the time I finished, the sun was starting to rise. I'd written 17 separate emails, each tailored to its recipient, each containing exactly the evidence needed to motivate action. My coffee had gone cold hours ago. My hip throbbed with pain. But I felt more clear-headed than I had in years, like I'd finally stopped pretending and started seeing clearly. I awakened at 5:58 on Christmas morning, 2 minutes before my alarm was set to activate. I'd managed maybe 90 minutes of restless sleep, my mind too active to fully shut down. I made coffee, the good stuff I saved for special occasions, and occupied my father's aged reading chair. He'd given it to me when I moved out, saying every home needed a proper reading chair. I sat in that chair with my coffee and my laptop and waited. At precisely 6:23 in the morning, Derek's existence began exploding in spectacular fashion. The first call originated from Steve, his business associate and partner in crime. I could perceive Derek's device ringing from my apartment. We lived in the same building, him on the 4th floor in a unit he'd convinced my mother to purchase as an investment property, me on the 1st floor in a tiny studio I rented because I couldn't afford anything better. The walls were thin enough that I could hear his phone ringing even from floors away, or maybe I just imagined I could. Either way, I knew it was starting. Then another ring, then another. By 6:45 in the morning, the calls were continuous, overlapping. His voicemail filling up so fast he probably couldn't keep up with deleting the messages. I pulled up the family messaging platform on my device to observe the spectacle, watching in real time as my carefully planned emails started landing and detonating. Derek had typed, "Madison, what did you do?" in capital letters at 6:31. The message appeared on my screen and I smiled. Actually, smiled. For the first time since he'd pushed me down. "What did I do, Derek?" I fought back. At 6:32, he attempted deletion, but 17 individuals had already captured screenshots, preserving his panic for posterity. The internet doesn't forget, Derek. Uncle Mark suddenly wasn't finding anything amusing anymore. His video had somehow appeared on multiple social platforms overnight, shared thousands of times, going viral in the worst possible way. Someone had tagged it, edited it to make Derek look as bad as possible, added captions explaining the context. "Evil stepfather pushes his stepdaughter down at Christmas dinner over a seat," had accumulated 50,000 views by morning, and the comments section was absolutely destroying Derek. People were finding his business, his social media accounts, Ashley's accounts, leaving reviews and comments everywhere. The internet had turned its attention to Derek Sullivan, and the internet can be merciless when it decides someone deserves punishment. Quick pause here, friends. If you're appreciating this Karma Holiday special, please hit that subscribe button and leave me a comment. Share your worst family dinner experience, or tell me about a time you had to stand up to someone who was abusing their power. Your support helps me share these narratives. And honestly, It signifies more than you comprehend. Every like, every comment, every share tells me these stories matter, that speaking truth about family dysfunction and abuse is important. Back to the chaos that was rapidly consuming Derek's carefully constructed life. Derek's business associates were the initial dominoes in what would become a spectacular collapse. Steve, Roger, Nathan, Brian, Olivia, and David. I swear I'm not fabricating those names even though the acronym they create is almost excessively perfect. Each received detailed documentation of Derek's creative bookkeeping, evidence they couldn't ignore or dismiss. By 8 in the morning, they'd called an emergency board meeting for Barrett Logistics, and Derek was very much not invited. The federal tax authority's tip included 5 years of inconsistencies I'd documented and organized with what I'd later learn was somewhat obsessive precision. Color-coded spreadsheets, cross-referenced documents, a paper trail so clear a child could follow it. Tax evasion is one of those crimes federal investigators love because it's usually straightforward to prove, and they have extensive resources for prosecution. I'd basically handed them a case with a metaphorical bow on top. Ashley's creditors received the genuine treasure, the information they'd been trying to find for months, Derek's actual assets, including the hidden accounts I'd discovered in his phone, accounts in other names, accounts offshore, accounts he'd thought were secret and secure, evidence that he'd been deceiving about his finances while his daughter avoided payment after payment, evidence that he had money but was claiming poverty. Big Marcus, I would later learn, doesn't appreciate being manipulated for a fool. When you lie to a loan shark about your ability to pay, they take it personally. And Derek had been lying to very dangerous people for a very long time. My mother's communication was different from the others, more personal, more painful to write. I included the original testament, the authentic legal document that showed my father's actual final wishes, plus comprehensive documentation of every property transfer Derek had manipulated her into signing while she was drowning in grief. Every fund withdrawal from accounts my father had set up to be protected. Every single thing Derek had stolen while she grieved for her husband, while she was at her most vulnerable. I concluded it with a simple inquiry, just 7 words, but they were words I needed her to face. Did you know, or did you choose not to know? By 700 hours, Derek was at my entrance. Not pounding like I expected, not demanding or threatening, whimpering, actually whimpering like a wounded animal. Through the viewing portal in my door, I could observe him in his holiday sleepwear, expensive silk pajamas that had probably cost more than my monthly rent, device in each hand, both ringing continuously. He appeared like he'd aged 10 years in 30 minutes. His hair was standing up in all directions. His eyes were wild, panicked, darting around like he expected someone to jump out at him. He kept looking over his shoulder, down the hallway, as if checking for pursuit. Then Ashley's voice resonated through the corridor, shrill and entitled even in crisis. She was screaming about her credit accounts being declined at a coffee establishment. On Christmas morning, while her father's life was imploding, she'd ventured to an upscale coffee establishment for her usual elaborate order. The entitlement was almost impressive in its absolute tone deafness. She was demanding Derek repair it immediately, her voice climbing to frequencies only dogs could hear, threatening to expose everyone about his secondary business if he didn't fix her credit cards right now. Even I remained unaware of a secondary business at that point, though I would learn about it soon enough. This was becoming superior to anything I'd anticipated, the house of cards collapsing faster than I'd dared hope. My mother arrived at 7:30, still in her nightgown with a coat hastily thrown over it. She must have driven straight from the house, not even taking time to dress properly. The expression on her countenance wasn't anger or sadness, emotions I could have understood. It was awakening, like she'd been sleepwalking for a decade, and someone had finally shaken her hard enough that she'd opened her eyes. She looked at Derek, then at me through my door's peephole, and I saw her face crumble. Not with grief, but with recognition. She finally saw what I'd been seeing for 10 years. Derek's device displayed 47 missed calls by 800 hours. I know this because he kept screaming the number as though it held significance, shouting it at my door like I was responsible for his disaster. 47 calls, Madison! 47! As if the volume of his catastrophe was my fault, rather than his own. Attorneys demanding explanations. Creditors demanding payment. Business associates demanding emergency meetings. Investigators demanding interviews. Even Ashley's arts institution calling about fraudulent loan applications he'd submitted in her name. Because apparently his crimes just kept going deeper. Each ring was another nail in the coffin he'd constructed himself. Another consequence of years of theft and fraud and manipulation coming due all at once. The family chat had evolved from confusion to commentary, to outright judgment. Cousin Rachel posted, "Karma's working overtime this holiday season. Sometimes people get exactly what they deserve." Grandmother simply wrote, "Finally." Just that one word, but it spoke volumes. My mother hadn't communicated a word online, but I could see she was reading every message, viewing every piece of evidence I'd shared, watching her entire life from the past decade revealed as a lie. By 900 hours, 3 news vehicles were stationed outside our building, satellites deployed, cameras ready. Apparently, Uncle Mark's recording hadn't just gone viral on social platforms. Someone had tagged it, framed it properly with context, and it was trending nationwide. "Evil stepfather gets exposed after pushing stepdaughter down at Christmas dinner," was the headline being shared everywhere. Derek shoving me at dinner was playing on loop across social media platforms, on morning news shows, in online articles. Each share added another crack to his reputation. Each comment section another jury pronouncing him guilty. People were finding everything. His business, his history, even beginning to uncover hints of his past under other names. 3 days following Christmas, just when I believed Derek was finished, completely destroyed, he pulled what I describe as the reverse victim maneuver, a move so audacious I almost admired it. The sheer brazenness of looking at complete disaster and thinking he could talk his way out. Almost admired it, but not quite. I was occupying my apartment reviewing the growing pile of legal documents, correspondence from investigators wanting to interview me, messages from news outlets requesting comments, when my doorbell rang at 700 hours on December 28th. Not Derek's desperate knocking this time. This was professional, controlled, the kind of knock that comes from someone who's done this many times before. The man at my entrance resembled an attorney from Central Casting, like someone had ordered a lawyer from a catalog. Silver hair perfectly styled, expensive suit that probably cost $5,000, and a smile that probably cost even more in dental work. He introduced himself as Thomas Brennan, partner at Brennan, Steinberg & Associates, one of the most expensive defense firms in Portland. He handed me papers with the type of flourish typically reserved for magicians extracting rabbits from hats. Except this rabbit possessed teeth and claws. Derek was suing me for $2 million for corporate espionage, defamation, and something called intentional infliction of emotional distress. That final charge made me laugh audibly, which probably wasn't the reaction Thomas Brennan had anticipated or prepared for in his carefully rehearsed delivery. The irony of Derek claiming emotional distress after pushing me down was so rich, it could have solved world hunger. Apparently, Derek had called in a favor from his recreational club companion, the one who always cheated at the 9th hole. The one Derek had mentioned multiple times as having connections. Thomas Brennan wasn't just any attorney. He was the individual who'd gotten 3 chief executives off on technicalities in high-profile corporate fraud cases, who'd made careers out of finding loopholes in seemingly airtight prosecutions. His retainer alone probably cost more than Derek possessed at this point. But apparently he was working on contingency, wagering on a substantial payout if he could somehow turn this disaster around. The counterattack was actually clever, I had to admit. Someone had done their homework and crafted a narrative that could potentially gain traction if people weren't paying close attention. Derek claimed I'd utilized my position in regulatory oversight to steal trade secrets, that I'd violated confidentiality agreements, that my so-called malicious prosecution had cost him millions in lost business. The lawsuit painted me as an obsessed stepdaughter who'd fabricated evidence out of jealousy, who'd manufactured a case against an innocent man out of resentment over not being the favorite child. He'd even located 2 former colleagues of mine, Kelly Martinez and Marcus Chen, both terminated from my firm 18 months ago for expense fraud. They were willing to swear in affidavits that I'd bragged about taking down my stepfather, that I'd talked about revenge, that I'd shown them evidence I'd supposedly fabricated. The fact that both had been fired for fraud themselves, that both had grudges against our firm, apparently didn't matter to Thomas Brennan. or didn't matter enough to prevent him from using their statements. But the genuine shock arrived at midday when I was reading through the lawsuit for the third time, trying to process the audacity. Ashley appeared at my entrance with a camera crew. Not news media, not legitimate journalists. She'd hired a documentary filmmaker, an individual named Chad, who ran a YouTube channel called Real Stories, real people with about 50,000 subscribers. Chad was going to film her narrative of being victimized by a jealous stepsister, her tale of woe. She stood in my corridor, completely blocking my doorway, fake crying into the camera with the kind of dramatic flair that would make soap opera actresses jealous. She wailed about how I'd always resented her success, which was hilarious given that her only success had been in spending other people's money. She claimed I'd fabricated evidence because I was bitter about not being my father's favorite, rewriting history so dramatically that I barely recognized the story she was telling. She accused me of being the genuine villain, of destroying her father to get my hands on inheritance money, of being obsessed with revenge to the point of criminality. The narrative was spreading with alarming speed. Derek had hired a public relations firm to manage his image. Well, actually it wasn't a firm. It was just some individual named Kyle, who operated a reputation management service called Second Chance Image Consulting from his mother's basement, but he was surprisingly effective at what he did. He'd gotten Derek on local morning shows, planted sympathetic articles on fringe news websites, started hashtags designed to reframe the narrative. The hashtag falsely accused started trending in our local area, with bots and fake accounts amplifying the message. They'd edited Uncle Mark's recording, slowing it down, adding commentary, making it appear like I'd thrown myself down intentionally to frame Derek. The manipulation was obvious if you looked closely, but most people don't look closely. Most people scroll past, absorb the headline, and move on with their day. The internet, as I was learning, loves a conspiracy theory more than it loves actual truth. By December 29th, day 4 of this nightmare, I was receiving death threats from strangers who'd decided I was an evil stepdaughter, attempting to destroy a hardworking family man. Messages filled with vitriol. Strangers who knew nothing about the situation, but felt empowered to send me detailed descriptions of what they thought should happen to me. My employer, concerned about the publicity and the allegations, placed me on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. It was a standard protocol, they assured me, but it felt like another betrayal. My neighbor, an elderly busybody named Mrs. Henderson, who'd never liked me much anyway, started a rumor that I was mentally unstable, that she'd heard me talking to myself, that she'd seen me acting erratically. Even some family members started questioning whether Derek might have a point, whether maybe I'd gone too far in my response, whether family problems should have been handled privately. Maybe Derek had a point, they whispered. Maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe pushing someone down wasn't really that serious. Maybe I was the vindictive one. The worst moment arrived when my mother called on December 29th evening, doubt creeping into her voice like poison. I could hear it immediately, the questioning tone, the hesitation. "Madison," she said quietly, her voice small and uncertain. "Derek's attorney showed me documents today. They look authentic, official. Did you—" She couldn't even finish the question at first. "Did you plant evidence? Did you fabricate any of this?" The fact that she could even ask that question after everything I'd shown her, after all the proof I'd compiled, after Derek had literally pushed me down in front of her, felt like being shoved all over again. Maybe worse, because at least when Derek pushed me, I'd expected it from him. But my mother? The woman who'd raised me, who'd promised my father she'd take care of me. Her doubt was a betrayal that cut deeper than Derek's violence. Derek went on local morning television on December 30th morning, on a program called Good Morning Portland, that typically covers lost dogs, community bake sales, and heartwarming stories about teachers going above and beyond. The type of show where everyone is relentlessly cheerful and nobody asks hard questions. Perfect for Derek's purposes. He wore his best suit, the navy one he reserved for important meetings, and what I call his wounded deer expression. Eyes slightly sad, voice carefully modulated to convey hurt but not anger, posture open and vulnerable. He'd practiced this, clearly. He talked about raising me like his own daughter since I was 19, conveniently leaving out every incident of favoritism, every act of cruelty, every theft. He spoke about the pain of being betrayed by someone he'd tried to love, his voice actually breaking convincingly at several points. He talked about just wanting our family back together, about being willing to forgive if I'd just admit I'd made mistakes. The host, a woman named Jennifer Chen, who'd clearly never fact-checked anything in her life, nodded sympathetically while lobbing softball questions. She didn't ask about the financial evidence. She didn't ask about the mortgages on my mother's house. She didn't ask about Ashley's gambling debts or the shell companies or any of the substantive accusations. She just let Derek spin his tale of woe unchallenged. Meanwhile, Thomas Brennan was proving himself very good at his job. Really good. Worth every penny of that contingency bet he was making. He'd found a technicality in how I'd accessed Derek's device. Apparently, looking at an unlocked device without explicit permission, even if it's sitting openly on a counter, could potentially be considered unauthorized access to electronic equipment under certain interpretations of computer fraud statutes. It was a stretch, but it was enough to muddy the waters. He'd systematically turned my documentation into evidence of an obsessive vendetta. Every note I'd taken, every photo I'd captured, every file I'd saved became proof that I was stalking Derek, that I was obsessed with destroying him. The organized nature of my evidence, which should have been a point in my favor, was reframed as proof of premeditation and malicious intent. He'd even suggested in court filings that I'd manipulated my elderly grandmother into participating in my scheme, taking advantage of an old woman's grief for her dead son to enlist her in a conspiracy. It was disgusting, but effective. The hearing was scheduled for December 30th afternoon. The judge assigned to the case, Patricia Martinez, was known for favoring dramatic reversals, for being the kind of jurist who loved overturning conventional wisdom. Derek's legal team had momentum building, media sympathy spreading, and a narrative that was starting to stick despite the evidence against it. That evening, December 29th, I sat in my father's old reading chair with my laptop, wondering if I'd played my cards too early, if I should have waited, gathered more evidence, built a more airtight case, if Derek was about to flip the entire table and walk away clean while I became the villain in this story. I fell asleep in that chair around midnight, exhausted from stress and worry, my dreams filled with courtrooms and accusations and my father's disappointed face. December 29th, the day before the hearing that would determine whether Derek's counter-narrative would succeed, everything changed again. But this time, Derek's carefully constructed defense collapsed, like a house of cards in a hurricane, spectacularly and completely. It started with Kyle, the reputation management expert working from his mother's basement. Apparently operating a public relations campaign from your mother's basement has limitations, specifically your mother. Your mother who has her own life, her own history, her own connections that you know nothing about. Kyle's mother, Helen Patterson, was a retired librarian who'd spent 40 years working at the downtown Portland library. She recognized Derek immediately when Kyle showed her who he was working for. She recognized him not from any recent interaction, but from her reading club 15 years ago in Las Vegas, Nevada, back when she'd lived there before retiring to Portland to be near her son. Derek had gone by the name Derek Morrison Walsh back then, and he'd scammed 6 widows out of their collective savings before disappearing into the night. Helen didn't just call the police. She called her entire network of reading clubs across 3 western states, a network she'd built over 40 years of library work and book clubs. Librarians, it turns out, are remarkably well-connected and have excellent memories for faces and stories. By noon on December 29th, 14 different women had come forward with stories about Derek. Different cities, different names, but always the same scam. Target recent widows, gain their trust through grief support groups, marry them quickly, drain their assets, disappear. The wounded family man persona that Derek had used so effectively evaporated faster than Ashley's modeling career aspirations. Each woman had documentation, photos, police reports filed in various jurisdictions. One woman had hired a private investigator who'd tracked Derek across 4 states before losing his trail. Another had court judgments against him under different names. Together, they painted a picture of a career criminal who'd been running this exact con for over 20 years, victimizing vulnerable women at the worst moments of their lives. Then Kelly Martinez and Marcus Chen, my former colleagues who'd agreed to testify against me, had a sudden attack of conscience. It was prompted by federal investigators showing up at their doors at 6 a.m. on December 29th with very pointed questions about perjury. Apparently, lying in a federal investigation is still illegal, even if a fancy attorney asks you to do it, even if you're being paid to do it. They flipped faster than pancakes at a breakfast restaurant, admitting that Derek had paid them each $5,000 to lie. More than that, they admitted Thomas Brennan had coached them on exactly what to say, had helped them craft their statements to be maximally damaging to me. It was witness tampering, subornation of perjury, multiple serious crimes committed in broad daylight. But the real bombshell, the revelation that changed absolutely everything, came from an unexpected source that nobody could have predicted. Thomas Brennan's legal assistant, a quiet, middle-aged woman named Dorothy Chen, who'd been taking notes in every meeting, who'd been sitting in the corner so quietly everyone forgot she was there. Dorothy had been recording everything legally since Oregon is a one-party consent state, meaning only one party to a conversation needs to consent to recording. Dorothy had consented on behalf of herself, and neither Thomas nor Derek had bothered to ask if she was recording. Derek, not knowing he was being documented, had been extremely candid about fabricating evidence, bribing witnesses, and his plans to flee to Panama once he somehow got the settlement money from his lawsuit against me. He'd laid out his entire strategy in detail, apparently assuming that attorney-client privilege would protect everything discussed in those meetings, not realizing that privilege doesn't extend to legal assistance and doesn't cover future crimes. Dorothy didn't just quit her job. She marched into the district attorney's office on December 29th afternoon with 6 hours of crystal-clear recordings, color-coded transcripts she'd prepared over sleepless nights, and what she called her conscience folder. Every dirty trick Thomas and Derek had planned, every lie they'd prepared to tell, every witness they'd planned to bribe or intimidate, all of it documented with the kind of meticulous detail that made prosecutors weep with joy. Apparently, Dorothy's daughter had been scammed by a stepfather in a similar situation 5 years earlier. The daughter had lost her inheritance, her home, her sense of safety. Dorothy had been waiting for exactly this moment, watching for a case where she could make a difference, where she could stop someone like the man who'd destroyed her daughter's life. The documentary filmmaker Chad, who'd been following Ashley around for several days filming what was supposed to be her vindication, accidentally became the hero we didn't know we needed. He'd been live streaming a lot of his footage, thinking it would build buzz for his eventual documentary, trying to generate interest, and maybe get picked up by a streaming service. What it actually did was capture Ashley admitting on camera that she knew her father was guilty of everything I'd accused him of. She said it casually, laughing, while he was setting up a shot outside a coffee shop. The microphone caught it clearly. Of course Dad's guilty, but who cares? We need the money. Madison's always had everything anyway. Now it's our turn. She also mentioned the secondary business again, Derek's side operation. Apparently, Derek had been selling counterfeit luxury goods online for years, using the Barrett Logistics warehouse for storage, using company shipping accounts to mail packages, using the business as cover for what was essentially a fencing operation. He'd been buying fake designer handbags, watches, and clothing from suppliers in China and Southeast Asia, then selling them online as authentic. The profit margins were huge, the risks were high, and he'd been running the operation for at least 5 years, according to Ashley's casual revelations to the camera. By evening on December 29th, Derek was at my entrance again. Not with lawyers or cameras this time, but alone, completely alone, desperate, and somehow even more pathetic than his previous begging session. He'd apparently realized that his legal strategy was collapsing, that the recordings Dorothy had made were devastating, that witnesses were flipping left and right. He actually tried to play the family card, his voice rough from stress and probably from shouting at his lawyers. Madison, we can work this out between us. We're family. We can find a solution that works for everyone. I recorded the entire conversation on my device from the moment I heard his voice in the hallway, my phone in my pocket capturing every word. The recording included the part where he offered me $50,000 to drop everything, then $100,000 when I didn't respond. Then finally, his voice breaking with desperation. Whatever you want, just name your price. $1 million? $2 million? I can get it. I can liquidate assets. Just tell me what it'll take. He was bargaining with money he didn't have, making promises he couldn't keep, drowning and grasping at anything that might save him. My mother arrived while Derek was still begging outside my door, his voice increasingly frantic. She'd spent the day with grandmother at grandmother's house, the two of them going through old photos in grandmother's attic, old documents grandmother had saved in boxes, and apparently old recordings grandmother had made. My grandmother, it turned out, had been far more proactive than anyone realized. Apparently my father had suspected Derek was a con artist before he died. The suspicion had started early, within 6 months of Derek and my mother dating. My father had noticed things, small inconsistencies in Derek's stories, reactions that didn't quite fit. So he'd done what any protective father would do. He'd hired a private investigator named Michael Torres, gathered extensive evidence, documented Derek's past under previous names. But the cancer had progressed too quickly. The diagnosis had come back stage 4, aggressive, terminal. My father had gathered the evidence but died before he could act on it, before he could warn my mother properly, before he could fully protect his family. Mother had found it all in a safety deposit box at a bank across town, a box she'd forgotten about in the chaos and grief following my father's death. She'd been paying the annual fee automatically without remembering why. The bank had sent a notice about updating their records, and she'd finally gone to see what was in the mysterious box she'd been maintaining for a decade. Inside was everything. The private investigator's reports, photos of Derek meeting with his previous victims, police reports from 5 different states, even a video my father had recorded explaining everything he'd discovered. Grief does strange things to memory, makes you forget important things while remembering trivial details. My mother had literally had the key to exposing Derek for a decade and hadn't known it. The expression on Derek's face when Mother played the recording of him bragging to someone about landing the grieving widow jackpot was almost worth everything. The recording was from my father's private investigator, captured on a hidden camera during one of Derek's meetings with another con artist. Derek's voice was clear and unmistakable. "This widow's perfect. Dead husband left her everything. She's so deep in grief she'll believe anything. Plus she's got a daughter, which makes the widow more desperate for stable male influence. It's the easiest score I've had in years. Almost worth everything. Almost. But not quite." That evening after Derek had slunk away and Mother had gone home to process everything, to sit with the magnitude of her mistakes and the weight of my father's protection, even from beyond the grave, I sat alone in my father's old reading chair with my laptop. There was one folder I'd been avoiding since I first discovered it, labeled simply, "For my daughter, open when ready." I finally felt ready, finally felt strong enough to face whatever message my father had left me. The first file was a video. My father, thin from chemotherapy, his skin pale, his eyes sunken, but still somehow bright with intelligence and love. He was sitting in his study, the one Derek had taken over, the room I'd spent countless hours in as a child while he worked. The timestamp showed it was taken 3 weeks before he entered hospice, when he'd known his time was extremely limited, but had still been lucid enough to plan. His voice was weaker than I remembered, thinner, but his words were steel. "Madison," he began, and I started crying immediately at the sound of my name and his voice. "If you're watching this, it means Derek Sullivan has shown his true colors. It means he's hurt you, betrayed you, possibly tried to steal everything I built for you. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you myself, sorrier than you'll ever know. But I've left you the tools to protect yourself." He held up a folder, thick with documents. "Everything in here is backed up in 3 places. This laptop, a safety deposit box at Pacific Bank in Seattle under your name that will become accessible when you turn 25, and with my attorney, Daniel Foster, in Seattle. If anything happens to one copy, you'll have the others." What followed was 20 minutes of my father methodically laying out Derek's history. His voice remained steady despite his physical weakness, the voice of a man who'd built a successful business through attention to detail and unwillingness to quit. Derek's real name was Derek Morris Worthington. He'd been born in Cleveland, Ohio, to a middle-class family, had gotten a business degree from a mediocre college, then had started running cons in his mid-20s. He'd been running the widow-targeting scam for over 20 years across 7 states: Ohio, Illinois, Nevada, Arizona, California, Oregon, Washington. My father had tracked down 11 victims, women Derek had targeted, romanced, married, and robbed. He'd recorded their stories on video, gathered police reports from multiple jurisdictions, compiled evidence that painted a picture of a serial predator. Derek wasn't just a con man. He was a serial predator who specialized in widows with children, using the children's need for a father figure as leverage to keep the mothers compliant. But then my father revealed something that made me gasp so loudly, my neighbor probably heard me through the wall. I didn't confront him because I needed him to think he'd won. You see, sweetheart, federal investigators have been watching Derek for 5 years. Agent Maria Rodriguez from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division approached me 6 months ago with evidence that Derek was part of a larger operation. We've been building a federal case together, using our family as bait to catch not just Derek but his network. The video continued with my father explaining the trap he'd set with meticulous detail. The testament Derek thought he'd destroyed, the will that had gone through probate, that was a carefully prepared fake. My father had worked with his attorney to create a dummy will that would satisfy Derek's greed while protecting our assets. The real will was filed in Seattle, drafted by a top estate attorney, ironclad and unbreakable under Washington state law. The business accounts Derek had access to, those were honeypots with sophisticated tracking on every transaction. My father and the FBI had set up the accounts to appear valuable while actually containing minimal assets, with every withdrawal and transfer being monitored and documented. Even the residence, the house my father had built with his own hands, was in an irrevocable trust that would activate on my 30th birthday or upon evidence of Derek's fraud, whichever came first. I knew I wouldn't be there to activate it, my father said, and I watched tears stream down his gaunt face, his voice breaking for the first time. I knew my time was limited. The doctors had been very clear about my prognosis, but I knew my daughter would be strong enough to finish what I started. You're stronger than you know, Madison. You're smarter than Derek will ever understand, and you have something he'll never have: integrity. The next file was labeled Maria Rodriguez, FBI contact, with a phone number and an email address. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial, but I managed to input the number. She answered on the second ring like she'd been waiting for years, like she'd been checking her phone regularly, just in case today was the day. "Miss Barrett," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "I was wondering when you'd call. Your father said you'd know when the time was right. He said you'd wait until you had all the pieces, until you understood the full picture." It appears he was correct. What followed was a conversation that changed everything I thought I understood about the past decade. Derek's secretary, the woman named Veronica who'd been working at Barrett Logistics for 3 years, the one Derek had been supposedly having an affair with according to whispered gossip. She was Agent Maria Rodriguez, undercover for 3 years. She hadn't been having an affair. She'd been documenting everything from inside the organization, gathering evidence, building a case with the kind of patience that federal investigations require. "We've been watching and waiting," Agent Rodriguez explained. "Your father helped us establish probable cause, but we needed Derek to commit enough federal crimes that we could charge him with major offenses. The counterfeit goods operation, that's what really got our attention. Derek's not just a small-time con artist anymore. He's connected to an international fraud ring we've been tracking for over a decade. The side business selling fake goods, it turned out, connected to a massive international criminal organization. The suppliers Derek was buying from were part of a network that moved hundreds of millions of dollars in counterfeit goods annually, funding everything from drug trafficking to human trafficking to terrorism. Derek had stumbled into something much bigger than his personal cons, and the FBI had been using him to trace the connections upward in the criminal hierarchy. We were waiting for Derek to make his big move," Agent Rodriguez explained. "We knew he was planning something major, some scheme to liquidate all his stolen assets and disappear. The lawsuit against you, Miss Barrett. That was it. That was the move we'd been waiting for. He committed federal wire fraud when he filed that lawsuit with knowingly false statements. He committed witness tampering when he bribed your former colleagues. He's now facing charges that will put him away for decades. And more importantly, he's going to flip on his suppliers to try to reduce his sentence." But my father had left one more surprise. One final gift from beyond the grave. A folder labeled The Network contained contact information for all of Derek's previous victims, the 11 women my father had tracked down. Over the past week, while I'd been fighting Derek's public relations campaign and dealing with death threats, these women had been organizing. Helen Patterson from the reading club, Kyle's mother, had been the catalyst. She'd connected them all through her network of contacts, creating a support group, sharing stories, realizing that together they had power they'd never had individually. They'd formed a victims support group, hired a collective attorney named Jennifer Torres who specialized in fraud cases, and were preparing a massive civil suit. They'd been planning their own strike against Derek, coordinating with my efforts without even knowing I existed. My father had set it all in motion before he died, giving each woman the contact information for the others, planting seeds that would bloom years later. The final video file was short, recorded the day before my father entered hospice care. He was in my childhood room, sitting on my bed that I hadn't slept in for years. The room looked exactly as I'd left it when I moved out at 19, like a shrine to my adolescence. He was holding the teddy bear he'd given me when I was 5, the one I'd named Mr. Snuggles, the one that had comforted me through nightmares and bad days. "Madison," he said, and I could see how much effort it took him to speak clearly, to get these final words out. "I need you to know 3 things. First, I'm proud of who you've become. You're strong, intelligent, kind, and principled. Everything I hoped you'd be and more." He paused, struggling with emotion. "Second, your mother will need time to heal. This will shatter her world. She'll question everything about the past decade, every decision she made, every time she chose Derek over you. She'll blame herself, and she should to some extent. But she'll also need forgiveness. Be patient with her. She loved me deeply, and grief made her vulnerable. Derek exploited that vulnerability. It doesn't excuse her choices, but it explains them." He smiled then, that mischievous smile I'd missed so much, the one that always appeared when he was particularly pleased with himself. "And third, Derek's biggest mistake was underestimating you. He thinks you're just a sweet compliance officer, someone who follows rules and doesn't make waves. He has no idea you got your fighting spirit from both your parents. Your mother was fierce before grief diminished her. And you've seen me build a business from nothing, seen me handle difficult people, seen me solve complex problems. You have all the tools you need." The video ended with him placing the teddy bear on my pillow and whispering, barely audible, "Justice isn't revenge, sweetheart. It's balance. Restore the balance, my darling girl, and then live your beautiful life, the life you deserve, the life I won't be here to see but that I'll be watching over somehow, somewhere." I sat in that chair and sobbed for an hour, crying for my father, for my lost decade, for my broken family, for everything Derek had stolen, but also crying with relief, with vindication, with the knowledge that my father had protected me even from beyond death, that he'd loved me enough to plan for every contingency, to give me every weapon I'd need to fight back. December 30th arrived with a blizzard that shut down half of Portland and a tactical law enforcement team that didn't care about weather. The arrest happened at 600 hours in the morning, exactly when dawn was breaking through snow clouds. Federal investigators don't believe in sleeping in, don't believe in waiting for convenient times. They believe in shock and overwhelming force. Derek was in his underwear when they knocked, having apparently been awake all night based on the condition of his apartment. Ashley was screaming about her rights, her voice shrill enough to shatter glass, clearly having no understanding of how law enforcement actually works. And somehow Kyle, the public relations individual, was there too, having apparently spent the night at Derek's apartment crisis, managing from the couch, trying desperately to spin a narrative that couldn't be spun. All 3 were arrested, though Kyle was released 4 hours later, once investigators realized he was just catastrophically stupid, not criminal. He genuinely believed he was helping an innocent man, having done 0 actual research into Derek's background. The hearing scheduled for that morning to address Derek's lawsuit against me became something else entirely. Judge Patricia Martinez, who'd been prepared to hear Derek's claims that I'd fabricated evidence and maliciously prosecuted him, instead found herself presiding over an emergency asset freeze hearing. The courtroom, normally half empty for civil proceedings, was packed with federal investigators, victims, lawyers, and media. Federal investigators presented their case with the type of precision that made my compliance-loving heart sing with professional appreciation. Charts, documents, recordings, witness statements, all organized with meticulous detail. Agent Rodriguez took the stand, still in her persona as Veronica the secretary, but now in FBI credentials. 3 years of undercover work distilled into 2 hours of absolutely devastating testimony that left no doubt about Derek's guilt. She documented everything methodically. The embezzlement from Barrett Logistics, with specific dollar amounts and dates. The fraud perpetrated against my mother, with timestamps on documents and recordings of conversations. The money laundering through shell corporations, with financial records showing money flowing through 6 different countries. Even Derek's abandoned plans to murder my father by switching his medications, a plan he'd discussed with Ashley thinking they'd never be caught, a plan he'd only abandoned when he realized my father was dying quickly enough on his own. Thomas Brennan, Derek's expensive attorney, tried to withdraw from the case so fast he actually tripped over his briefcase rushing toward the judge's bench. But Judge Martinez wasn't done with him. She'd been reading Dorothy Chen's transcripts during the hearing, and her face had grown progressively darker. Apparently, Dorothy, the legal assistant, had recorded Thomas Brennan knowingly suborning perjury, coaching witnesses to lie, helping fabricate evidence. It was every attorney's nightmare, their crimes documented in crystal-clear audio, with timestamps and transcripts. His law license was suspended before lunch, pending a full disciplinary hearing. The victims' network appeared in the afternoon session, like an avenging army of respectable women in pearls and sensible shoes. 14 women, all over 60, all presenting similar stories with different names and dates. They'd coordinated their appearance, arranged to testify in sequence, creating a devastating pattern that no jury could ignore. Each woman took the stand, calmly and methodically describing how Derek had targeted them, romanced them, married them, stolen from them. Together, Derek had stolen over $3 million over 20 years, leaving behind broken women and destroyed families. The civil suits alone would destroy him financially for the rest of his life, but the criminal charges were what really mattered. The IRS agent who testified actually smiled while reading the charges, clearly enjoying his moment. Tax evasion across multiple years, tax fraud through false business expenses, filing false returns for both personal taxes and the business. The list went on for 20 minutes, each charge carrying potential prison time. Derek owed $1.4 million in back taxes, but with penalties and interest compounding for 10 years, the actual amount was closer to $3 million. They'd frozen everything he owned: bank accounts, investment accounts, the car, even the quarters in his vehicle's cup holder. My mother took the stand in the late afternoon to validate the trust documents and explain how Derek had manipulated her. She was composed, clear-eyed, speaking in a steady voice that only occasionally cracked with emotion. When the prosecutor asked about Derek's character, she paused for a long moment, looked directly at Derek sitting at the defendant's table, and said with absolute clarity, "I was grieving, he was hunting." The entire courtroom went silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Even the court reporter stopped typing for a moment. But the moment that broke Derek completely, that destroyed any remaining fight he had left, was when Ashley took the stand for the prosecution. Faced with her own charges related to the counterfeit goods operation and receiving stolen property, faced with potential prison time of her own, she decided to flip on her father to save herself. The scorpion had stung itself. The monster had turned on its creator. She detailed every scam she'd witnessed, every crime she'd been peripherally involved in, every lie Derek had told. She produced recordings she'd made of conversations with Derek, insurance she'd kept for exactly this moment, knowing that eventually her father would throw her under the bus to save himself. She'd decided to throw him under the bus first. She even admitted on the stand that she'd known I was innocent, that she'd participated in the smear campaign against me because Derek promised her money. "I knew Madison didn't do anything wrong," she said, not looking at me. "But Dad said if we could win the lawsuit, we'd have enough money to disappear, to start over somewhere Derek's past wouldn't follow us. I just wanted a fresh start." The federal prosecutor handling the case, a woman named Jessica Torres, who'd made a career of putting away white-collar criminals, laid out the full scope. This wasn't just fraud or embezzlement or even organized crime in the traditional sense. It was racketeering under federal RICO statutes, the kind of charges usually reserved for mob bosses and cartel leaders. Derek hadn't acted alone. He was part of a network that targeted vulnerable women across the country, sharing information about potential victims, helping each other establish false identities, even providing alibis when one of them needed to disappear from a failed con. The counterfeit goods operation connected to international criminal organizations in 7 countries. The money laundering involved banks in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Singapore. Derek had started as a small-time con artist targeting widows, but had evolved into something much more sophisticated and dangerous. By the end of the day, after 12 hours of testimony and evidence, Derek had been denied bail as a flight risk. His passport had already been flagged that morning when he'd tried to book a ticket to Panama at 4 a.m., probably the moment he realized his legal defense was collapsing. Every asset was frozen, every potential avenue of escape blocked. The man who'd pushed me down was now falling through the criminal justice system, and unlike me, nobody was going to help him up. Nobody was going to give him the benefit of the doubt or a second chance. New Year's Eve arrived with champagne and vindication, and a sense of possibilities I hadn't felt in a decade. The family gathering was at grandmother's residence this time, in her spacious Victorian home that had always felt more welcoming than my childhood home had become under Derek's occupation. She'd declared the old venue permanently tainted by Derek's presence, and when grandmother spoke in that particular tone of absolute conviction, nobody dared argue. The atmosphere was surreal in the best possible way. The same people who'd watched in silence as Derek pushed me down, who'd sat frozen while I struggled on the floor, were now treating me like a hero. Uncle Mark had become my biggest supporter and most vocal advocate, mainly because his video had been optioned for a true crime documentary and he was receiving substantial payment. To his credit, he donated half the money to a charity supporting domestic violence victims, keeping the rest for what he called his apology fund, an account dedicated to taking me to very expensive dinners and buying me gifts to make up for being what he called an absolute idiot and terrible human being. Rachel had proven herself a true cousin through everything, the kind of family you choose rather than the kind you're born into. She'd spent the week helping other victims file paperwork and navigate the legal system, working entirely pro bono because, as she said repeatedly, watching Derek get destroyed is payment enough. I'd do this for free forever. She'd even started dating Agent Rodriguez's partner, a very nice FBI accountant named David Chen, who loved spreadsheets and data analysis as much as she loved justice and legal proceedings. They'd met during one of the evidence review sessions and bonded over their shared appreciation for well-organized documentation. My mother arrived early to help set up, something she hadn't done for family gatherings in years. She'd been in therapy since December 27th, attending an intensive program for victims of long-term manipulation and emotional abuse. She was going 3 times a week, working with a therapist who specialized in helping people recover from relationships with narcissists and con artists. She looked different, not just happier, but present in a way she hadn't been for a decade. She made eye contact when speaking. She offered opinions without looking around nervously to see if Derek approved. She'd started wearing red again, my father's favorite color on her. She'd packed away all the clothes Derek had bought her, the muted neutrals and conservative styles he'd preferred, and had gone shopping for clothes she actually liked. "I need to apologize properly," she said to me in grandmother's kitchen while we were arranging platters of food. She said it not to the room full of family in the dining area, but directly to me in a private moment. Not for being fooled. Grief makes fools of us all, turns us into people we don't recognize. But for choosing comfort over courage, for letting him dim your light, because looking at your pain would have forced me to see my own darkness. You deserved a mother who fought for you, who protected you, who believed you. Instead, you had to fight for both of us. You had to be strong enough for 2 people. The room went silent when we emerged, but it was a different kind of silence than Christmas Eve. This was respect, acknowledgement, the kind of profound moment that heals deep wounds. Grandmother stood up, raising her champagne glass with a steady hand, commanding the attention of the entire gathering. "This family failed Madison once," she announced, her voice clear and strong despite her age. "We sat silent while she was hurt. We chose comfort over courage. We will not fail her again. And we will not forget that justice came not from us, but despite us. May we earn the forgiveness she's showing us by being here tonight. May we be worthy of the second chance she's giving us." At exactly midnight, as the ball dropped on the television in the living room and everyone cheered and hugged, my device received a notification. The trust my father had established had officially activated. The family business, Barrett Logistics, was officially mine, transferred into my name with all the legal protections my father had built around it. The house I'd grown up in was in my name, though I'd already decided to let my mother continue living there as long as she wanted. Every protection my father had meticulously put in place had triggered exactly as he'd planned a decade ago. It was January 1st, 2024. New year, new life, new beginning, new possibilities stretching out before me like an unwritten book. Derek, meanwhile, was spending his New Year's Eve in federal detention, in a cell with concrete walls and a steel toilet, and a roommate who'd been arrested for check fraud. Brittany had been released on bail, but was under house arrest at a halfway house on the east side, required to wear an ankle monitor that beeped if she went more than 50 feet from the building. Her social media dreams of influence and fame had been replaced by court-mandated community service, 200 hours at a homeless shelter. She'd gotten a job at a fast food restaurant, having no other options with her criminal record and lack of any actual skills. The uniform, a polyester polo shirt and visor, did not photograph well for Instagram. Someone, I never found out who, had sent me a photo from the detention center's New Year's celebration. Apparently, they'd had sparkling apple cider in plastic cups and stale cookies from a bulk supplier. Derek was sitting alone in a corner wearing orange instead of designer labels, his expensive suits and watches and status symbols all gone. The man who'd needed to be the center of attention, who'd crafted his entire life around being admired and envied, was now just inmate number 4847329. The best part, the absolute best part that made me smile every time I thought about it, was that the documentary producers wanted to interview me. Multiple production companies had reached out, competing for rights to the story. The working title they'd all settled on was Pushed Down Standing Up, A Christmas Crime Story. They were offering enough money to not only pay off my student loans, but to restart the scholarship fund my father had created before he died, the one Derek had secretly dissolved to fund Ashley's lifestyle. Derek's downfall would fund other people's dreams, would give opportunities to students who deserved them, would create something positive from all the destruction he'd caused. 6 months later, in June 2024, I sat in my father's office at Barrett Logistics, now truly mine in every sense. I'd moved in slowly, first changing the locks, then removing Derek's belongings, then gradually adding my own touches. I'd hung my father's awards and certifications back on the walls. I'd brought in plants, which Derek had hated. I'd opened the blinds to let in natural light. The space finally felt like it belonged to someone who cared about the business, rather than someone who saw it as a personal bank account. I was preparing for Derek's sentencing hearing, reviewing my victim impact statement, deciding what I wanted to say to him one final time before he disappeared into the federal prison system. The federal case had been swift and decisive once Derek realized he had no defense. He'd pleaded guilty to 47 separate charges, hoping for leniency in exchange for cooperation. He'd given investigators information about his network, about the suppliers of counterfeit goods, about money laundering operations in 3 countries. He wouldn't get the leniency he hoped for. The judge assigned to sentencing, a woman named Patricia Hawkins, who'd been one of my father's clients years ago and remembered him fondly, didn't hide her disgust as she reviewed Derek's presentencing report. Derek got 25 years in federal prison, to be served at a medium-security facility in California, far from his victims and his former life. No possibility of parole for at least 15 years. He'd be 73 years old when he became eligible for release, his entire life effectively over. The courtroom erupted in applause when the sentence was announced, highly unusual in a judicial proceeding, but Judge Hawkins allowed it. "Sometimes," she said, gaveling for order but smiling slightly, "justice deserves recognition. Mr. Sullivan, you targeted vulnerable women at the worst moments of their lives. You exploited grief, you destroyed families, and you showed no remorse until you were caught. This sentence reflects not just your crimes, but your complete lack of humanity." Ashley got a plea deal for her cooperation, 2 years probation and 3,000 hours of community service. She'd actually become a decent employee at the fast food restaurant, reliable and hardworking in ways she'd never been in her previous endeavors. She'd been promoted to shift manager, taking pride in her work for the first time in her life. Her social media platform, instead of the glamorous lifestyle content she'd always posted, now featured motivational quotes about redemption and humility. She posted pictures of herself mopping floors with captions like, "Humble beginnings leading to character development at last. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find yourself." The family business, Barrett Logistics, had not just recovered but thrived under my management. The employees, freed from Derek's toxic leadership style and constant theft, had increased productivity by 40% within 6 months. Morale was higher than it had been in a decade. We'd won back contracts Derek had lost through his incompetence and gained new ones from the publicity. Ironically, being associated with the victim of a con man, rather than the con man himself, turned out to be good for business. I'd instituted profit-sharing and employee ownership programs that made everyone invested in our success, turning the company into the kind of place my father had always envisioned. My mother had sold the tainted family home, unable to live with the memories Derek had poisoned, and bought a smaller craftsman-style place near the beach in Cannon Beach. She'd started dating my father's old friend, Daniel Foster, the attorney from Seattle who'd kept the real Will safe for a decade. He was nothing like Derek in any way. Quiet where Derek had been loud, kind where Derek had been cruel, honest where Derek had been deceptive. He was stable, employed, and genuinely cared about my mother's well-being rather than her assets. Most importantly, he asked me for permission before proposing to my mother, sitting down with me over coffee and nervously explaining how much he cared for her, how he wanted to make sure I was comfortable with the relationship. I gave permission gladly, genuinely happy to see my mother with someone who treated her well. The Victims Network had become a formal nonprofit organization called Second Chances Support Network, helping widows and widowers recognize warning signs of predatory relationships and escape before significant damage was done. Helen Patterson was its president, running the organization with the efficiency of someone who'd managed library systems for 40 years. They'd already helped dozens of women and a few men, providing resources, legal assistance, and emotional support. They'd named their annual fundraising gala the Madison Barrett Memorial Gala, which made me cry every time I saw invitations or promotional materials. Agent Rodriguez, Maria as I now called her, having transitioned from considering her an undercover investigator to considering her a genuine friend, had received a promotion and a teaching position at Quantico. She was training new FBI agents in undercover work, using the Derek case as a textbook example of long-term investigation and evidence gathering. The case study was titled, "How Greed and Narcissism Create Their Own Downfall, a Case Study in Patient Investigation." Derek had literally become a cautionary tale used to train federal law enforcement. The documentary had aired on a major streaming platform to huge ratings, trending in the top 10 for 3 weeks. It was called Christmas Dinner, a True Story of Family Betrayal and Justice. Uncle Mark had become a minor celebrity, giving talks at conferences about bystander intervention and the importance of helping family members in need. He spoke at colleges, community centers, even corporate events about recognizing abuse and having the courage to act. He donated all his speaking fees to domestic violence shelters and programs helping children in foster care. He'd bought me a car with his video royalties as a gift and apology, a beautiful blue Tesla with a vanity license plate that read "Pushed Back." But the best moment, the moment that gave me the most satisfaction, came when I visited Derek in federal prison in June. I hadn't planned to go, hadn't wanted to see him or waste any more energy on him. But my therapist, who I'd been seeing weekly since January, suggested that confronting him might provide closure. Not for him, but for me. Not forgiveness, which he didn't deserve, but finality. I drove to the prison in California, went through security, sat in a cold visiting room with guards watching, and waited for Derek to be brought out. He'd aged dramatically in 6 months. His hair had gone mostly gray. He'd lost weight, the kind of weight loss that comes from stress, rather than health. His orange prison uniform hung loosely on his frame. But it was his eyes that had changed the most. The confidence and superiority were gone, replaced by something hollow. I handed him a single photograph across the table. The one thing I'd brought. The Christmas dinner table from our holiday gathering, professionally photographed at my request, fully set for our New Year's Eve celebration. My seat prominently displayed with its bronze plaque reading Madison's Place, that I'd had restored and polished. The same plaque my father had made, now returned to its rightful position. "That seat," I told him, my voice steady and clear, projecting across the visiting room so the guards could hear too, was never about hierarchy, or being the favorite or any of the things you thought it represented. It was about family recognizing family, about love creating belonging, about earning respect through character, rather than demanding it through fear. You'll never understand that, because you've never been family to anyone. You were just a parasite who mistook patience for weakness, who confused kindness with stupidity. He tried to respond, opening his mouth to speak, probably to make excuses or plead for something. But I was already standing, already walking away, already done with him forever. The guards later told me, in a phone call I received a week after my visit, that he'd stared at that photograph for hours after I left. He'd kept it in his cell, looking at it every day, finally beginning to understand that his single act of cruelty on Christmas Eve had cost him absolutely everything, while giving me back everything he'd tried to steal. A year after that Christmas push, in December 2024, we gathered again for the holidays. The table at grandmother's house was full, actually fuller than it had been before. The invitation list had expanded to include people who'd become family through shared experience rather than shared blood. Maria Rodriguez came with her partner David, having become genuine friends rather than just professional contacts. Several women from the victims' network came, women who had nowhere else to go, women who'd lost their families to con artists like Derek. We'd created a new family from the wreckage of our old ones. Daniel was there, having married my mother in a small ceremony in September on the beach in Cannon Beach, nervous but happy as he practiced his toast as my mother's new husband. Even Ashley had been invited, though she chose to volunteer at a homeless shelter instead, recognizing that her presence might make people uncomfortable, sending a genuinely heartfelt card with a long apology for her role in everything that had happened. Grandmother, now 86 and sharper than ever despite her age, raised her glass for a toast. The room fell silent, everyone recognizing the moment's significance. "Last year," she began, her voice clear and strong, "we learned that silence in the face of injustice makes us complicit, that watching evil and doing nothing makes us participants in that evil. This year, we've learned that redemption is possible for those who genuinely seek it, who do the hard work of change. And we've learned that justice, while sometimes delayed, is worth fighting for, worth waiting for, worth believing in even when it seems impossible." As everyone clinked glasses, the sound of crystal ringing through grandmother's dining room, I thought about my father's words from that final video. Justice isn't revenge, it's balance. Restore the balance. The balance had been restored in ways that went beyond punishing Derek. The business was thriving and helping employees build better lives. The scholarship fund was giving opportunities to students who needed them. The victims' network was protecting people from predators. My mother was healing and rebuilding her life with someone who genuinely cared for her. The balance had been restored not just through Derek's punishment, but through using his crimes as a catalyst for creating something better. They say you should be careful who you push down because they might know how to get back up. But Derek Sullivan learned a much harder lesson. Be careful who you push down at Christmas dinner. They might have a deceased father who planned for this exact moment a decade ago. They might have a federal investigator working undercover as a secretary. They might have a grandmother who's been quietly documenting your crimes while pretending to be confused about her smartphone. They might have more allies, more evidence, and more determination than you ever imagined possible. The price of one push, one moment of casual cruelty, one act of violence in front of silent witnesses, was everything. Everything Derek had schemed for over decades. Everything he'd stolen. Everything he'd built on lies and manipulation came crashing down from that single moment of Christmas dinner cruelty. He'd thought he was pushing down a weak stepdaughter, someone powerless and without resources or allies. Instead, he'd pushed the first domino in his own destruction, set in motion a chain of events that would expose every crime, reveal every lie, and destroy every part of the life he'd fraudulently constructed. Thank you for listening to my story. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and leave a comment. Let me know what you think about family dynamics, about justice, about standing up to abuse. Share your own stories if you're comfortable doing so. A new story is coming soon.